Welcome to all of it. We got all of it.
All of it. All of it.
Our guest is Secretary Madeleine Albright, Bryan Cranston, Tank and the Bangas, Barry Jenkins, Celia Keenan-Bolger, Aaron Lee Carr, Esperanza Spalding, Gideon Glick, Helen Yoyemi, Fab Five Freddy, Banga Akanabe, Brene Brown, Tony Goldwyn, Tandy Newton, Jake Gyllenhaal. Welcome to all of it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello.
What a pleasure.
Hi.
This is so fun.
I'll see you tomorrow.
We're here every day, 12 to 2. Impromptu concert. I love it. I love it. I love it.
I was there for the love of it.
You must tell the truth.
I'm sure everyone's perspective is unique.
There's a lot of truth about the pain of being an immigrant, but they're jokes. We find the funny.
It's our strength.
At what point do you think women's health care will stop being a political issue?
When half of Congress can get pregnant.
Ran out of words, but we do what we do. We don't have no board, so we got to trade twos.
So we trade twos, I was this really dope groove, and Allison was so nice to meet you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our June Get Lit with All of It book club event with Anna Sale. I'm Alison Stewart. For our regular book club members, hello, welcome back. For folks joining us the first time, welcome to our book club. It's more like a book party, actually. And for those of you who don't know me, I host WNYC's Afternoon Arts and Culture program, All of It, with Alison Stewart. That's helpful, 12 to 2. And one of the things on the show we love so much is books. And that's why we started this book club, so we could share it with you and have a dialogue with you and just read some really good books. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to talk to Anna. We also have music at our book clubs. We're very excited to have Mary Gauthier join us later. She also has a book coming out, so it's a twofer on that one. And then at the very end of the show, we will announce our July Get Lit with All of It book club selection. And I want to tell you, this book is on the most anticipated lists of the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, I think Slate, and possibly the New York Times. So that's what we call a tease. Let's get to the main event. Many of you know Anna Sale from her podcast, Death, Sex, and Money. And for those of you who are introduced to Anna for the first time through her book, Let's Talk About Hard Things, you know that she has a unique talent for getting to the heart of the matter, to helping people not make it easy, but make it easier to talk about difficult things. And because we have a partnership with the New York Public Library, drum roll, please, 4,113 of you checked out Anna's book. Anna, welcome to Get Lit.
Thank you, Allison. That's so great. Thank you, New York Public Library readers. That makes me happy.
That's a lot of readers. A lot of people need your guidance, Anna. So, you know, you not only talk the talk, you walk the walk. You start this book with a very personal story. You get right to it. It's about your divorce. Did you always know you were going to start the book that way?
No, I think I had to be talked into it. But I felt like, you know, it really was the right place to start for me, because that was a moment in my life when my relationship to what words can do really shifted. I was 30 years old. I had been married for about 4 years. It was my first marriage, and we were having all the hard conversations we could to try to figure out why we were increasingly out of sync and feeling at each other. And I sort of, before this period, I kind of had this confidence that, like, if you work hard enough, if you go to enough couples counseling, if you read the books, if you reread the books, you can sort it out together. And that didn't work. The relationship had kind of come to an end. And what was comforting to me as I sort of absorbed that shock was talking to other people in my life, loved ones, friends, mentors, anyone who would talk to me really about moments of kind of big transitions that they'd gone through, where they sort of had the road fall out from under them. And it really, that's what helped me move into whatever was coming next, and to realize, like, oh, life is not something to be fixed with words and hard conversations. Hard conversations actually accompany us. They help us describe what we're going through. And when you do that in community, it does make the hard stuff more tolerable, easier to sit with and face.
I thought it was so interesting that one of the first things you write in your book is that you need to ask yourself why you want to have this hard conversation. What can be challenging about that?
Oh, I think because, you might have that little voice in the back of your head that's like, I should say this dig that's really going to advance my point of view in this conversation. And to go like, hang on, why am I doing that? Or if you're in a like sort of protracted long conflict with somebody who you care about, and figuring out what is that gut feeling that you need to talk to them about, and what is it that you want to unwind together with them. Is it something you don't understand, something about how they're behaving that you kind of want more information about? Is it a way that you feel hurt or like you've not been heard? Because once you sort of take that time to prepare and think about why you want to open a hard conversation, it helps you with that first sentence, which is to say, I'd like to talk to you about something important. I've been feeling X. And then you can say, can we talk about that? So you kind of want to know when you're introducing to the other person you want to have a hard conversation with, like, here's why I want to do this. I hope you will buy in with me and talk with me about this because it's important to me. But that way you can be clear about why you want them to talk with you about it.
You do say, though, while you should be clear and honest, this is not a manifesto for radical honesty, I think is how you put it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really important. Like the thing that I wanted to get at in this book was how our relationships are changed, reinforced, strengthened by conversations that try to get a little bit closer to the red hot center of what's happening. But in a relational way, like radical honesty, I think of sometimes as I'm going to say the truth without thinking about how it might land to the person's ears that I'm saying it to. I think there's a way to be clear and honest and also be mindful about trying to be as kind as you can. I learned the aphorism from Maria Bamford, the comedian, say what you mean, but don't say it mean. I love that.
I love that. That's perfect. Say what you mean. Let's dive into the subjects, okay? We're going to begin with the end, with death. Mm-hmm. We do Instagram polls. Our book club meets on Instagram in between the live events and before. So we asked our Instagram readers whether they avoided conversations about death. 68% said no. 32% said yes. What do you think of that result?
I think that seems about right, and maybe it's a little bit harder to avoid conversations about death in this moment that we're in together than if it had been a couple of years ago. But I'm kind of curious, like, in what way are they talking about death? I think it can be, we can be summoned to talk about death if we have someone we love who has had a terminal diagnosis and they know they are going to die, and it is a time to acknowledge that. I think it can be much more difficult to talk about death if you, for example, have an elderly parent and and you as an adult child don't want to look at the fact that they are getting closer to the end of their life. So maybe you're avoiding that conversation, or you don't even know how to start it because you don't want to make them feel somehow like you're pointing out that they are closer to the end of their life if that's not something they're comfortable with. So I think there's a lot of ways that we are good at talking about death, in some ways where we could use some help.
What did you learn about yourself even from having conversations with someone who is dying?
Well, I mean, the one I write about in the book is a conversation I had with a very dear friend of mine named Anne, who is 89 years old, and she is not dying as far as we know, except that she's 89. So, and I became friends with her when she was 82. And I just she has been an incredible mentor and support and friend to me. And I was noticing that I would have this feeling after we had dinner together, like I would go home at night and I would get this pit in my stomach and just think like, oh my gosh, we don't have as much time left as I wish we did. Like, because she's not my age, she's many years older. And I was like, what is that about? Like, what is that anxiety about? What do I need to express to her? So I asked her if I could sit down and talk with her about what it's like to be in your 80s and thinking about your own end of life, and whether you do think about it more than when you were in your 40s, for example. And what I found from that conversation was, I still have that anxiety that flashes in front of me every so often when I think about what it's going to be like if I'm here and she's not. That didn't go away from talking about it, but I took the opportunity to sit down with her and tell her, like, you're the very best. And I just want you to know, like, it's interesting to me to have become so close to you at this point in your life. This is how I feel about you. And so now I know that I've at least had that conversation. That's what I can do.
To our viewers, I want to let you know you'll have the opportunity to ask Anna questions. Best way to do that is if you're watching via YouTube, put your questions in the chat, or you can always send them to us anonymously on our Instagram at allofitwnyc. So we'll get to those in about 10 or 15 minutes. So feel free to think about a question for Anna that you really want answered. When we talk about death, we talk about, and I think a lot of people don't know how to approach someone who's dealing with a death. Someone who is grieving. I've been watching a person I know, very strong woman, sort of grieving very publicly on Facebook, which has been heartbreaking to watch, but it's also been really interesting to see what she's saying. Don't do that. Don't need that. Don't want that. What are some ways that people can help those who are grieving? And what's some good language?
I mean, I think I learned this from a grief counselor named Megan Devine, who I talked to, who lost her partner when he was 39 in a sudden drowning accident. And she talked about how painful it was to feel the imposition of other people's needs to feel like they were being helpful on her. Them saying things like, you're young, you'll find someone else, you'll get through this, kind of like a cheerleadery way of trying to be supportive, which I understand. But how she ended up feeling was, now I have this weird obligation of trying to show that I'm feeling okay so that this person who's comforting me will feel like they're comforting me in an effective way. And that took energy. And she said that was at a time when, like, waking up in the morning and reminding herself that her partner was gone was taking 99% of the energy she could summon. So she recommends things like, I'm so sorry. This is something I remember about him, just kind of sharing and being willing to walk towards that, the loss of it, which can be scary for us, especially in social situations with acquaintances. Like, how do you do that in an appropriate way? One thing I've learned while talking to people about this book is how comforting it can be if someone says, oh, I lost my grandmother last year, it was really hard, to just, if you didn't know the grandmother, say, oh, what was her name? And then they have an opportunity to say, she was Catherine, she lived her whole life in West Virginia, like, give them a moment to remember the person. That can be special, because I think often around death, we don't want to even name the person for fear of upsetting the grieving person, but that in fact makes the grieving person more invisible.
All right, we're going to talk about sex, our next topic.
All right.
We asked our readers if they found it difficult to talk about sex. 54% said no, 46% said yes. So almost a split down the middle. I'm curious, in your research and doing your podcast and in writing this book, how much does someone's willingness to talk about sex have to do with how they were raised or even introduced to sex?
I think a lot. I mean, certainly like the family culture they grew up in, the time that they grew up in, the gender expectations that they felt imposed on them as they were growing up certainly have a lot to do with it. I think for me, speaking from my own experience, like, I grew up in a family of healthcare providers. So the body and the facts of the body were always something that we acknowledged. Talking about things like desire and pleasure, not so much part of the family conversation, something I had to learn from other people.
You got the mechanics down.
I did. So yeah, I think that when we talk about how we talk about sex, often there's this sort of like macro narrative that like, of course, we talk about sex in a much more open way now than we did 50 years ago. And perhaps that's true, but certainly there's still people walking among us who were raised in a really different time, raised in a really different family culture, perhaps have, sexual trauma that makes it difficult to share openly. So, each of us, it's not just one thing about who is more able and comfortable talking about sex than others.
What are some of the fears people have around talking about sex?
Well, something I wanted to acknowledge in the chapter is I think what can be so tricky about sex conversations, especially if you're talking to an ongoing partner or a potential partner, the risk in a sex conversation is what we want and need might not match up. That's why flirting at a bar with a new person and trying to figure out if they want what you want feels like exciting, but it's risky, and even in the context of a long-term partnership, like to look at your partner and kind of say like, oh, I've been feeling depressed and I'm in a different place. Like acknowledging a change in what you're up for physically together can be tricky, because I think we're afraid of, when you talk about sex, you are risking shame, you're risking looking clumsy, you're risking looking desperate, all these things, and you're risking rejection or having to reject, which also can feel uncomfortable and like something you want to not be direct around. So those stakes are there.
You notice something interesting in the book, that the pressure on our long-term relationships and partnerships have increased over the years, and the stakes of these conversations get higher and higher. Did you get a sense of what's behind that pressure?
I mean, I think a lot of people have written about this, from everyone from like, David Brooks to Esther Perel, about how we, what expectations we have for our romantic partnerships and nuclear families. It's not just an economic relationship. We want soulmates. We want, hot sex for the course of our relationship. Like that's a lot for one relationship to bear. And maybe wasn't so much when our communities looked a little different. And especially if you add child rearing to it and you don't live with an extended family. So that's a lot of pressure on one relationship. And I feel like when it comes to sex and intimacy conversations, there's the added kind of thing that can be quite hard to talk about, which is like how we're changing in our bodies as we are in our intimate relationships. Things like aging, things like illness, things like weight gain, weight loss, things like pandemic, like all these things can change our appetite and our like energy for wanting to be together. But that also has a relational component too, because then again, you're risking that feeling of being rejected or having to reject.
You talked to a sex worker in the book, Ty. What lessons does Ty offer that you think could be really useful to someone who might never have the opportunity to have a conversation with a sex worker?
Okay, let me tell you, I'm going to paint a scene. I was at a book club in Cody, Wyoming last night with mostly middle-aged and older women, and they'd all read my book. And we went from death to sex, just like we did and then as soon as sex came up, someone goes, how about that sex worker? And then we talked about the lessons that Ty offers. If to be clear, Ty is someone who has had sex for money. He has performed in porn for money and had sex on camera. He also is in a long-term monogamous relationship, or excuse me, not monogamous relationship. And so he's has sex with other people. And so all of these encounters take communication about like, what is it? What are the terms that we're meeting in this particular context? And he says two things that I thought were really useful. He talks about all sex being transactional, which can sound kind of cold and mercenary, like, but I actually think it can be really nice to just think about, oh, that is what's happening when we're having sex. I am offering something to you and you are offering something to me. We might be getting something different from our encounter, but we are exchanging something. And when it's a transaction, you also have to figure out if it's consensual. And then the other thing he talks about, which I thought was really useful, was just how what a comforting opener it can be to just say, what are you into? Which of course comes from like gay cruising culture, but in any context, what are you up for tonight? What are you into? What do you like? It's this invitation to articulate, maybe the mood you're in that moment, or also more generally what you like if you're just getting to know someone. And it's this, invitation to both of you to say, how about we do this? What do you think? It's really like, I just love it. What are you into? No judgment. Just let's talk about it.
Want to remind our viewers that we're going to get to your Q&A portion in just a little bit. So you can put those questions in the chat for YouTube or go to our Instagram at alleviate.WNYC. The questions are starting to come in, Anna. So let me move myself along here. Let's talk about money.
Okay.
Our Instagram poll, 67% of readers said they found it hard to talk about money. You're shaking your head vigorously.
Yes. I think money can be so hard to talk about because it's kind of like, which part of money are we talking about right now? And often, if you're talking with someone you make financial decisions with, you go straight to the like, how much should we spend on the refrigerator? You think we should spend this? I think we should spend this. When really what you're talking about is the values you're bringing around stuff and where that comes from for each of you. But it often gets expressed as sort of a, attention about budget. The other thing that's really hard to talk about when it comes to money is we have a real reticence, no matter your financial background. If you have less than you think you ought to, or more than you think you've earned, there's this skittishness, because and shame. And so we don't trade stories of our financial histories as we tell our life stories, when we all know, of course, how much we started out with and where it came from, and how much debt we started out with and where that came from profoundly shapes the outcomes of our lives, and often has very little to do with what we did at the very beginning. These are histories that we inherit. And I just think it's so, when you just open up that conversation a little bit more, I first started thinking about this when we were doing our series about student debt on Death, Sex, and Money, and hearing from people about the profound sense of isolation and shame they had about their big student loan debts and how they hid it and how it was invisible. It was so deep and isolating. And then the reaction when we put these episodes out of people recognizing that this was actually like a collective experience for many people who shared a generation. Oh, this is a way that we have interacted with the system in this particular moment. This isn't a set of personal choices that were all my fault because I did the wrong thing and I was stupid. So that's what can be achieved when you open up a conversation about how money has fit into the plot of your life. You can see the way that each of us are interacting with these big systems, and making individual choices as we do interact with them.
I do want to add, this is purely anecdotal, but you've lived in New York, and back in the dark ages in New York in the 80s or the 90s, you got an apartment and somebody would be like, oh, how much you paid for rent? And you would tell them. Yeah. It was something you could say to somebody you just met. People were really open about how much they spent on their apartments and what did you buy that one for? People don't do that anymore.
Well, Allison, they have Zillow, so we're just spying on each other.
Zillow just got you. I'm just wondering if, on a serious note, if it's just the income disparities have become so great, and that money has started to go, I don't want to zoom around to the end of your book. People start assigning identity.
Oh yeah,
how much
absolutely.
You'll pay.
I mean, I actually thought about the identity chapter and the money chapter as sort of fitting together really nicely, because I think what hinders both conversations about money and identity is our discomfort with letting difference be in a conversation, in a personal conversation. You want to race to kind of, if it's a money conversation, if it's a friend, say, who's expressing that they're having a harder time than you are. Like that feels crappy. So you want to diminish that difference and say, I know that next great job is around the corner and you're going to be great. You know, you want to go into that encouraging mode instead of just sitting with them and being like, God, I know that this is really tough. And, you know, I don't have student loans, so I don't know what that's like. I mean, that's a scary thing to say to a friend, if, you know, like to acknowledge difference. But it's also like, that can be so nice just to have someone acknowledge reality. If you're the person who has less, you know, instead of having to like prove it, like act like that difference isn't there. And I think that's something that I thought about a lot with the identity chapter. Like, don't race to demonstrate that you are so well read and so well intentioned that you have all the intuition about what it's like to walk around in every body there is to walk around in. Like, no, like sit with the difference, and how that profoundly shapes how we move and are identified in the world and how we're treated in the world. And that's something to listen to and not to rush to say, oh, I understand that, you know?
Well, since your podcast is Death, Sex, and Money, I'm going to break here for some Q&A. We'll get to family and identity after. Let's see. Karen asks, hints for the hardest talks when a parent, partner, child, best friend are protecting a secret and most certainly lie about it. Maybe a car accident, a theft, something like that.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. That question of protecting a secret, which I sort of interpret as like, do we have a duty to disclose? What will be the impact if we disclose? And I think that there's not one answer, you know. I think it depends on the relationship you have with the person who doesn't know the secret. Because what you have to think through is like, I have this need to have this secret known. It is also going to change the status quo of our relationship. It is going to change their understanding of, you know, how you two relate together and perhaps how they read the past. And that can be really important to disclose if it's something that you feel like is a truth of yours that you haven't shared and you need them to look at it, even if it's upsetting. But there are other circumstances where people make other choices that they're, you know, mom doesn't need to know that this happened 30 years ago. We're going to let her not know that, you know? And those are questions that I think it's like families have to make together. You just have to sort of look at what are the consequences of disclosing this, and is this worth it?
Tom says, money. You said we talked about it until I neutralized my survival fears. I wasn't able to talk well enough about money or other topics to neutralize. How did you let the fears subside?
Well, I think it's not, for me, I am a fearful money person. And I have that feeling where it's like, ugh, like anything, like I just, it's uncomfortable for me to spend money. That's just the way I'm made. And what I've come to know is the survival fear is not gone. I've just come to notice it and say like, okay, Anna, that's showing you like, that's that part of you that is risk averse. That's that part of you that just likes to shovel money into savings because you're afraid you'll never be safe, you know, like, and then once you can sort of talk back to the feeling, that's my survival fear. But, maybe there's a reason why if I do make this money choice, it's an investment, it's sharing, it's doing something that has a higher purpose. So I think your survival fear tells you something, you know, when you talk about it, when you acknowledge it, oh, there it is. And then you can say like, is she right this time? Or do I want to talk back to her and make her go back in the cave? That's how I think about it.
We have 2 more categories to get to. Family, our readers. We asked whether they found it hard to have conversations with family members than with other people. And 77% said it was harder to talk to family, which is, I think that's not that surprising to me. I mean, you think about risk and fear.
Yeah.
You know, there were so many topics you could add to Death, Sex, and Money, and how did you come upon family?
I think for anyone who has grown up in a family, has a family of origin, is in a family now, you know that they can be really tough. And they can be tough in the way that they're they present issues that you need to talk about, and they also are this particular setting. The setting of family is one in which there can be this expectation of you ought to understand me. You ought to be familiar with this. You've known me since my entire life. Like, how can you be misunderstanding me? And so that can like elevate the tensions. But they also are these relationships in which our roles can be quite prescribed and rigid. I'm one of 5 daughters, and I will tell you, like, I am such a classic middle child. As soon as like we get all together, it's like I go back into the well-worn grooves, and it can be hard to be an adult with my siblings, and also with my parents who are getting older. So I wanted to look at those relationships in particular and dedicate time to that in a chapter all its own.
While it may be difficult to have certain conversations with family members, sometimes your family members can be the most hurtful.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And they can be both in the same conversation. They can be this like incredible landing place of like, oh, comfort, you know me, you know this whole story. And then they can just throw in that dig that you're just like, why you got to do that? That I think is family. And I think that one thing I wanted to articulate in the chapter was that is what family is, that dynamic. That is what that system of family has built into it, which is you have this common history, common origin, expectation of maybe understanding where each other comes from. And also when you're in a family, built into that is this idea of you're separating from them. If you're a child, when you start out in a family, you're going to grow up. You may leave the house. You may make different choices than your siblings. And that separation can feel kind of threatening if you don't acknowledge that, like, oh, this is what happens. This is what happens as families evolve. Like, we become different people as we are within this unit.
We actually have a family question. Thoughts regarding siblings meeting about their widowed mother's dementia diagnosis, who may have different views regarding her maintaining her independence, dignity versus consequences of losing that?
I think that is so hard. I actually was just talking to someone who was talking with their brother. They had just lost their mom, and they were trying to figure out, they had difference of opinion about what they ought to do with her house. And what she said was helpful. They got some outside help to help them have the conversation. And it helped, and they focused on sort of the values that they wanted to base the decision on. I think often we can get into something like, what kind of needs does our ailing mother need? You can kind of race to the logistics, the finances. How are we going to do this? We need to get this done. But starting with like, okay, like, what do you think is important to her? What's important to both of us? How do we do this together? And make space for you to sort of like maybe not be on the same page at first, but you hopefully, if you have that conversation around values, you can say, we're only going to do one thing for how we're going to deal with her care. So hopefully we can decide to do that together.
Let's talk about identity. We'll finish up. Our Instagram book clubbers say that 54% said yes, it's difficult to talk with someone who doesn't share the same identity. 46% said no. Interesting, again, a split. And I'm curious, I think this year has been particularly difficult this past year. There's been a lot of conversations about identity. What guidance would you give someone who has been well-meaning, but has put their foot right in it? How does one get out of that?
As soon as you see yourself as someone who has done that, as soon as you notice that your error has been noticed, acknowledge it, that you're noticing that. Oh my gosh, I think I was mispronouncing that. I'm really sorry. How do you say that? Acknowledge the error. And that's like, I think something that I really wanted to focus on in the identity chapter, and there's lots of what identity means a lot of things. In the chapter, I particularly looked at identities in which kind of we move around and how we identify and then how we're identified. So a lot of things like, gender, race, national origin, et cetera. And I think a really important starting place for a conversation across difference of identity is to think for yourself about like, how am I oriented in this conversation? Am I someone who has had a more regular sense of belonging in the environment in which we're having this conversation? For example, am I a white woman in a newsroom in New York City, and I'm talking to a coworker who is not? I have probably felt more sense of belonging in my workplaces. So maybe I need to go into this conversation with more of an attitude of listening and learning about things that I have not personally experienced, and letting, again, that gap of difference be, and not rushing to be like, oh, I see. So now here are the bullet points for the action items I'm going to do, and I think just thinking about what's your role in this conversation about identity, and also like being mindful, like all of us carry with us identities, like we're not one thing, and making space for that. But these are conversations where at the very beginning, especially if it's someone you don't know well, it's really important to go in with a spirit of listening, and with a spirit of not trying to rush in to demonstrate how well you are hearing them, or how well that you think you ought to have a trophy for the work that you've done on these things. Like just sit and listen. And if you're someone who has less of a feeling of belonging in an environment, I also write in the book about the importance of, like, you can opt out. That doesn't have to be your job in every conversation about difference, because if you are someone who is often in environments where you are the only one, that is a daily practice, and that is an exhausting practice of explaining how you move through the world. So sometimes you can just say, you can let things slide, and you can decide to pick it up another day when you have that energy.
Since you've been out on book tour, what do people want to talk about from your book?
I've actually, I should have expected this, but people want to talk about death. People want to share about people they've lost, losses they've experienced recently. That's been really, it's something I knew intellectually that we have all been experiencing, but to just hear names, here's my brother, here's this person, and it's not just COVID related deaths. It's, a lot of mental health crises. Like it's a lot of, there's a lot of loss in a lot of our circles of loved ones right now. And so I feel, I hope that this book is giving people permission to talk about that sadness, and without feeling like they need to act like it's not there. I almost want to say one wonderful thing, but it's sort of amazing, and the universe that your book came out when it did. It might have resonated differently 2 years ago. It sounds like it has really helped some people. Yeah, I hope so. Certainly, I don't know. I'm heartened by the 4,000 New York Public Library readers who said, I want more hard things in my reading.
As if New York's not hard enough.
So bless you. So I think in that way, oh my gosh, more hard things. But I do think if we didn't feel challenged in our how to talk about this stuff before the pandemic, certainly we have felt the weight on our own words, how we have phone conversations, how we have Zoom conversations, not being able to just sit with each other and hug each other to express love and care, having to use words, certainly I think made it more real for all of us, how hard conversations can be, and also how healing they can be when you open up that channel of vulnerability.
Well, Anna, we were so glad to have you be our June Get Lit with All of It book club author. We're going to ask you to stay put because our musical guest was recommended to us by you. Mary Gauthier is a well-known recording artist, a Grammy nominee, and Americana Music Award winner. Her new book, I want to make sure I read the title correctly, Saved by a Song, The Art and Healing Power of Songwriting. It's really cool because it's part memoir and sort of part workshop on how to write a song. And Mary is as honest and open, and we meet her at different points in her life. We meet her when she's in the throes of addiction. We meet her as she is learning about her birth mother. We learn about her working in a gay bar at the height of the AIDS crisis. In Saved by a Song, she writes that songs, quote, help us with the struggle of being human by letting us know we are not alone. Mary Gauthier, welcome to Get Lit.
I'm enjoying this conversation so much.
I'm so glad. Anna, did you want to ask Mary a question before I dive in?
Well, I just want to tell you, Mary, when they asked about a musical guest, I said, like, I want Mary, because when I think of your songs, I think of just kind of this unflinchingness about what can be painful and tough and sad. But at the end of a song of yours, I feel lightened. I feel just more connected. And I think that is so, that spirit is what I love. And I have to hear your songs, like to turn on your songs when you're in a moment of just either frustration with someone or a real sense of sadness. I have felt accompanied by you so many times. So I just want to say thank you. And I want to ask you if is that a way that you think about your songwriting? Do you think I'm going to go at these hard things, or do you think is that not a way in which you think about the ideas that power your songs?
Good question. There's no single answer. When I sit down to write, I try to find what is important to me, and almost always it's your podcast. It's the hard things. That's what mostly come to me when I sit down to work on a song. I'm not a pop writer. I'm not a country writer. Certainly in the current understanding of country music, I would have done well in Nashville in 1970, though. But I like going after what really matters to me, and so that's usually almost inevitably some sort of struggle. And I like to get to some understanding that I didn't have before I wrote about it, and then go bring it out there and see if people relate. And when I get the nods and the yeses, it helps me as much as, if not more, than it helps the listener.
Mary, did you want to ask Anna anything? I saw you. I could see you were listening so intently during our conversation.
Well, first of all, I'm in awe of how articulate you are, Anna. And you as well, Alison. This is great. The conversation is just, I love being in the presence of really smart women who can express themselves so well. How did you get started on this path, Anna? With your innate? Did you have an innate ability to as a middle child help with conflict resolution?
That's one of the ways I tell it sometimes. I also I don't know. I come from a big family of a lot of talkers, and I'm one of the less of a talker. So I'm one of the listeners in the family. But I also think it comes from, I just like to, I like music like your music. I've always I like moving through the world feeling feelings, and especially connecting with someone else. And that often leads you to conversations about the tender places, if you're having that exchange. So it's not that I'm great at problem solving or anything like that. It's more that I just really am driven by curiosity and connecting with people.
I love that answer. I remember writing a line many years ago, too many songs about happiness leave me sad, lonely, and depressed. I want to talk about what's real because I want to know you, and I want to know if we're in the same situation as human beings trying to, on a daily basis, not bump into each other and hurt each other. It's hard, and I'm interested in those kind of conversations too.
Mary, I'm going to ask you to set up one of the performances that you sent to us for the song I Drink, which you write in your book took you almost, I think it was 2 years to get right.
Yeah. What
was going on during that process? What were the steps to getting it right?
Well, it started in first person. In songwriting, pronouns really matter. And so if it's in first person, my assumption is that it's about me. And then a while into it, I realized, you know what, it's in first person, but I'm speaking as a character. And then I had to figure out who the character was. And somewhere in there I did figure it out, and I was speaking from behind the eyes of a country singer in Boston named John Lincoln Wright, who would have been a star if he wasn't so stubborn. And he really, really sang well. And had all of the components necessary to make it in country music at the time. But he had alcoholism and he had stubbornness, and those two things really got in his way. So the character, once I identified, it's kind of me and kind of Lincoln. So it's a mashup of Mary Gauthier and John Lincoln Wright. And then I realized, I'm writing it as if I had not gotten sober. I got sober July 13th, 1990, so I'm coming up on 31 years in a couple of weeks. It makes me old. I never thought I'd get old. This is the most exciting thing. I managed to do it. And so I'm writing from the future and imagining myself as someone who didn't get sober. And once I got that, then the song started coming alive, and I'm sitting in my mind in a room in Cambridge, in Central Square, in a cheap apartment, with a TV dinner coming out of the freezer and some liquor and some dope, and I'm blaming my situation on everybody else, particularly my father. And it's not my fault. And if you had my life, you'd drink this way too. And all of the classic alcoholism mantra blames. And that's when I figured out the song. It took a long time. And it was figuring out who was talking that was the challenge.
Here is Mary Gauthier performing I Drink.
He'd get home at 5:30, fix his drink and sit down in a chair, pick a fight with Mama, complain about us kids getting in his hair. At night he'd sit alone and smoke. I'd see his frown behind his lighter's flame. Now that same frown's in my mirror. I've got my daddy's blood inside my veins. Fish swim, birds fly, daddies yell, mamas cry. Old men sit and think. I drink. chicken TV dinner, 6 minutes on defrost and 3 on high. Beer to wash it down with, another, then some whiskey on the side. It ain't so bad alone here. It don't bother me that every night's the same. I don't need another lover hanging round trying to make me change. Fish swim, birds fly, lovers leave by and by. Old men sit and think. I drink and I know what I am, but I don't give a damn. Fish swim, birds fly, daddy's yell, mama's cry. Old men sit and think. I drink.
So Mary, I Drink is the first song that appears in your book. And you have this, it's such an interesting way to write a memoir, but also a book where people can learn something, not just about you, but can learn something about the craft of songwriting. When did you come upon this combo?
It's a mashup, isn't it? It's two things going on at one time. Well, the book started because I was asked to write an instructional book for Yale on songwriting. And then the editor of Yale University Press left the press before the book was published, and it inevitably got lost in the shuffle, so it didn't get published. So I had this instructional book going on, and then I was approached by St. Martin's, and they really wanted memoir. And so what I ended up doing at their guidance, which I think makes a much better book than an instructional book, is talking about my life in the context of the songs that came from my learning about songwriting. So I use songs to explain my deepening understanding of songwriting and to push the thesis, which is that songs can be much more than just entertainment if you need them to be.
Much like Anna, you were so honest and personal in this book, and you begin with a really hard story. You start with we follow as you get pulled over on driving under the influence, and you're so hammered that you don't even realize how bad it is until you wake up in a cell. What was it like to start the book with that story, and how did it feel to read it?
Well, I feel like it had to start there because I would have never become a songwriter if I hadn't have gotten sober, and I would have never gotten sober if I hadn't have got arrested. Mm-hmm. So it's my life as an artist began with sobriety. And sobriety began with handcuffs and flashing lights. I thought it was the worst possible thing that could happen, and in retrospect, it was a sacred gift. And that's what I wanted to talk about, is the gift of recovery and pairing that recovery with the creative life to move a deepening understanding of what caused addiction in the first place and how to heal from it.
I want to say the name of the book again, Saved by a Song, The Art and Healing Power of Songwriting. You use the word troubadour to describe yourself. And you write, troubadouring is an approach, not a genre. Inside the word troubadour, I hear the word true. Troubadours tell true stories, true to feeling, not fact. When did you first start feeling like a troubadour?
Well, when I started as a folk singer in Boston, that was what was modeled for me, was the lone songwriter on stage with a spotlight, a bar stool, a bottle of water, stories and songs. And the good ones could hold 5,000 people's attention, no problem. I just wanted it. I wanted that. I wanted the gift of resonance with an audience and not having to have a huge number of people on stage with me to do that. I just didn't want to be, in my life to this day, I don't want to run things. I don't want a band, a bus, a manager, and all of the things that accompany successful musicians, because I don't want to run things. I came to the music business from the restaurant business where I ran things, and it doesn't make me happy to run things. So the freedom of having stories, songs, and a guitar on my back, town to town, is still, I just can't even believe I'm getting away with it, and it's working. It's awesome. It's enough, and it makes me happy.
You talked about what an impact a song can have on someone and how it can resonate with someone, and it can be comfort, it can be healing, it can be illuminating. I'm curious, was there ever a time when you wrote a song and you got to the end of it and you realized you learned something about yourself from that song?
Oh yeah, the good ones every single time. Yeah, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the listener or the reader. You want to work yourself past what you know into this unknown darkness that you can poke around in with the melody and language and find something that you didn't know existed inside yourself. That's the goal for me, is to go past what I know every single time.
In your book, you write about your adoption, and I thought of you right away during Anna's interview when that listener, viewer, asked about a secret and what to do about a secret. Because once you found out who your birth mother was, she tells you that no one knew about you, that she had kept this secret the whole time. My question is about, what was it that made you want to actually seek out trying to find your birth mother? Because you were talking to somebody and they kind of blurted out once they found out.
I don't know. It seemed like I was just being pushed there by recovery, by I guess the pain of not knowing. The question marks became heavier and harder to carry. I knew that, oh gosh, I was going into a situation that in many instances just doesn't end well. And, that was kind of my experience, that in the time where I was put up for adoption, it was done in the closed adoption system, and the transaction was permanent and irreversible. And she internalized that and never told anybody that she had me, and she wanted to keep it that way and has kept it that way, and I've decided to honor and respect that. And it's painful for me, but I also get it. There was an agreement made with her, and in order to keep her life together, that's what was necessary for her. So I guess I needed to do it to know the story, but I still don't know the story, really. She wouldn't tell me. But I do feel a sense of self-respect for having the courage to go in there and do that. I can't remember being more afraid ever in my whole life. This is terrifying, to go into a vault and to try to find out where you came from.
Let's talk about Rifles and Rosary Beads, the album you worked on with veterans. as you were working with some of these veterans on their works and their songs, what was something that was difficult for them? Were there themes? Were there certain obstacles that would pop up?
Oh yeah. Well, I didn't start working with veterans, soldiers that are dealing with PTSD and other war wounds until I was about 20 years sober, and I had written several records, and I had a pretty good understanding of the redemptive, transformative nature of this art form, of what it can do and be if you need it to be. So I went in with that knowledge. But what I didn't understand is that, because I had no understanding of the military, is that the most frightening thing for them to do would be to be vulnerable. And to write a good song, it's a mandate. You have to be vulnerable. It was so terrifying, and remains so, for them to be vulnerable, because the training is that if I'm vulnerable, people die. That's not what we do. And yet, we talk about two kinds of courage: the kind of courage it takes to volunteer for the military and work your way up the ranks and become a member of special forces and fight in a war, that kind of courage. And then there's the other kind of courage of being emotionally vulnerable and speaking your truth about how you feel. And this is not innate in any way for people who are especially fresh out of the military. To speak of such things, we know this sort of, that if soldiers talk about war and killing and death, then they haven't actually seen it. They talk to each other, if they talk at all. They don't talk to civilians about this. And yet we're asking them to just tell us how they feel so we can get a song that captures where they are today. And it is scary for them.
What did you witness change? Well, you don't have to, obviously, we don't want to respect people's privacy, but what was a transformation you witnessed, even if it was something small?
Oh, so much, so very much. One of the shocking things for me is the vast majority of female veterans I've written with have all been sexually assaulted by fellow soldiers. It's so much worse than what we see on TV. It is really, really bad, and we need to fix that yesterday. I also worked with a soldier named Josh Gertz, and there's a whole chapter in the book about this, whose Humvee landed on an improvised explosive device, and he ended up in a wheelchair. And we wrote a song called "Still on the Ride" about his survivor's guilt, because a friend of his died, which was the deeper pain for him. The worst pain for him was the survivor's guilt, not being in the wheelchair. That came way down the list for him. But about 2 years after that, we did a show in Albany, where outside of where he lives, and he came and he surprised me by standing up out of the wheelchair and walking to the stage, slowly with a cane, but he got there. He plays harmonica, and today he's out of the chair. He gave the chair to an old Korean War vet. He had a really high-end wheelchair that could go on a beach and everything, and he found the right person for that chair. And he's up and walking, and he's got his legs back. It was hard work for him, but I think the beginning of hope is what inspired him to do that work. And that came from working at a retreat through the Songwriting with Soldiers program and speaking his truth in song. It's a powerful, powerful story.
Mary, you were kind enough to give us 2 performances. We want to hear Mercy Now. Will you set this up for us and also let our audience know what you'd like them to listen for in the song?
Yeah, what's interesting to me about this song is that it reinvents itself. I wrote it in 2002. It was a post 9/11 song when then President George Bush was building up to war, and I was strongly opposed. At the time, the Spotlight series in the Boston Globe was discovering and uncovering an unbelievably a high number of pedophile priests in the parishes in Boston area, and the now dictator's father of North Korea was testing nuclear weapons. All these things were happening, and my father had gone down with he had a car wreck, and he had brain seizures when he withdrew from alcohol, and he had Alzheimer's-like symptoms, and his cognitive functioning was very low. All this was happening at the same time, and that's where the song was born. And fast forward, now it's 20 years later, and the song has all new meaning, and it still works. That's amazing to me.
Mm-hmm. Mary Gauthier, thank you so much for spending time with us tonight, and thank you for these 2 performances. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, and it's really wonderful to meet you both.
This is Mercy Now.
Well, my father sure could use a little mercy now. The fruits of his labor falling right slowly on the ground. His work is almost over, won't be long, he won't be around. I love my father, he could use some mercy now. And my brother sure could use a little mercy now. He's a stranger to freedom, shackled to his fear and doubt. The pain that he lives in, it's almost more than living will allow. I love my brother, he could use some mercy now. My church and my country, they could use a little mercy now. As they sink into a poison pit, it's gonna take forever to climb out. They carry the weight of the faithful who follow them down. I love my church and country, they could use some mercy now. Every living thing could use a little mercy now. Only the hand of grace can end the race towards another mushroom cloud. There's people in power who'll do anything to keep their crown. I love life, life itself could use some mercy now. Yeah, we all could use a little mercy now. I know we don't deserve it, but we need it anyhow. We hang in the balance, we dangle between hell and hallowed ground. And every single one of us could use some mercy now. Yes, every single one of us could use some mercy now.
Thank you so much to Mary Gauthier for those incredible performances. And of course, to Anna Sale, our June Get Lit with All of It book club author. Okay, it's time to announce our July Get Lit with All of It book club pick. It is one of the hottest books of the summer. Everybody wants to check this book out. I will tell you what it is. But first, I really need to say thank you to our partners at the New York Public Library, Tony Marks, Brian Bannon, and Andrew Medlar. They help get those books, those ebooks into your readers and the books into your hands every month. I also want to say thank you to the Green Space team for putting this all together, producing it. That's Jennifer, Emma, Ricardo, David, and Utski. And then I also, of course, have to thank the producers from Team All of It who do all this extra work and putting Get Lit together. That's Megan Ryan, Jordan Loff, and Simon Close. All right, on to our July book. This novel was named a most anticipated book of 2021 by Time, The Washington Post, Harper's Bazaar, Marie Claire, Bustle, BuzzFeed. We are going to be reading The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dalila Harris. The book is set in New York City, and it's a thriller that takes place in an unlikely place, publishing. Our protagonist is Nella, a 26-year-old editorial assistant who is the only Black employee at Wagner Books. She is hopeful when another Black woman named Hazel is hired, but their friendship is tested when Hazel becomes the star of the office. And sinister notes start appearing on her desk, on Nella's desk, ordering her to leave Wagner now. Nella starts to wonder whether those threats are coming from Hazel. Kirkus called this, quote, a brilliant debut. So New Yorkers, head to wnyc.org/getlit to find out how to borrow an e-copy of the novel from the library. We have unlimited copies available. And then mark your calendar for July 29th at 7 p.m. when we will be doing this with Zakiya and a special musical guest to be announced. In the meantime, please follow us on Instagram at allofitwnyc. That's where our book club lives during the month before the big events. We have discussions and announcements, and it's actually really a whole lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for reading our books, and I will meet you back here next time.